Oh, everything.
Facebook Live?
We are Facebook Live. We are Twitter. We are the Facebook group, and we're the YouTube, and we're the ARF page.
Wow,
we are big time, and
that's a lot of Jason.
You're nodding.
Yeah, yeah. I don't believe you. Scotchy Scotch. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. This is how to write effective horror for the contemporary audience. So I envisioned this with Jim as kind of a combo. You know, you've been to panels, you've been to workshops. I thought it'd be interesting to maybe try to combine the elements of those two things. So what I did was Jim had this really good prompt, which was, hey, how do we keep people scared now? How do we examine all the forces at work on horror consumers so we better understand what makes them scared? And so I've got a thesis about that. I've got some ideas. I've got some tips. Hey, Chris.
Hey.
I've got a way of approaching it that I think could be effective, but I thought it'd be fun if we kind of interrogated that as we went. So I'm going to lay out a framework, and I'm just going to invite you to, you could approach this as a lecture where you go, oh, these are answers. I'll try to apply these answers. But I think it's even more effective to think of it as exercise for your brain. So just test out these ideas. So I'll say, I think this might be effective. Just think to yourself, like, would that be effective for me? How does that match how I think about my writing or how I approach stories? Think about this as like go into the gym for an hour for your writing muscle about horror and genre. That's what I would invite you to do. By interrogating, what I mean is like, we should talk about it. So if you're not automatically doing it, I'll reach out into the audience and say, hey, what do you think about that? What are responses to that? So it will be conversational. I know everybody says that when they get in front of a microphone, but I think it would be fun for us to talk, especially since it's a pretty intimate group. It's, you know, the 8 of us and the 6,000 places on the internet where we are streaming to. So introductions, I'm Jason Tostevin. I am a writer, filmmaker, producer. I also co-founded and programmed Nightmares Film Festival, which is in Columbus, Ohio. And there's only one festival ranked higher on Film Freeway than Nightmares Film Festival. And you're at it right now. You're at the one that's ranked higher. So congratulations, good picks. Well done, Jim. So the question in front of us is, how do we write effective horror for the contemporary audience? So starting with some, I'm going to make some assumptions, narrow this conversation down because it's a giant conversation we could have all night at the bar. A couple assumptions I'm going to make. One is, in that question are really two questions. One is, how do we write effective horror? What are the fundamentals of horror? And the other is, are there things we should do specifically or differently because people have a different experience with horror now than they did 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years ago. Okay, so really two poles for us to explore. What makes for great horror, effective horror writing, and then are the things we need to consider, do differently, or could be to our advantage that are different now in the current environment? And I think the answer to the latter is obviously. So I know it'll be clear to everybody right away, but just for the purposes of like seeing how stark the difference is for horror consumers now than say, pick 15 years ago. So once upon a time, if you were a horror fan, how the frequency that you consumed horror, your access to horror, and your ability to talk about it with more people and build a community was minuscule compared to what it is now, right? So once upon a time, I went to Family Video, or I think it was called Valley Video, up the street from us. And when I could scrape together the money, I go to the store. This is one time a week. I look at all the shelves. How do I pick the movies? I'm not watching trailers, right? I don't have friends to tell me what to watch. I'm looking at cover art, which fucking lies. Never the stuff on the cover is never the stuff in the movie. But so you pick the cover art, you watch the movie, you watch it all weekend because you have it till Sunday night. And that's the movie you knew about and watched for that week, or maybe for that month, or maybe for that quarter, right? may not have that many opportunities to watch it. And then when you wanted to talk about it, maybe you had the one friend who also liked horror and wanted to talk about it with you. So your ability to consume, the rapidity of your ability to consume, your ability to identify something that you would like, and your ability to talk about it with other people dramatically reduced compared to, of course, now, right? When you can get instant access anywhere you want to the rarest things, and also find out from other people what the rare classics are, right? Because we didn't even know at the time. I didn't know. So the audience, the consumer today is definitely, I would submit to you guys, is definitely different in its experience. It's sort of like, anybody have this experience where you watched a movie on anybody remember broadcast where it happens once a week? It's currently happening on HBO. It's
Appointment television.
the last
is what we
place
used
in
to
the
call it.
world.
Appointment television.
Have you ever watched something that came out weekly and then gone back and binged it? Has anybody done that?
Yeah.
Gone back and watched it streaming? Was there a difference in the experience for you between the two? What was the difference? Or what were some of the differences?
The thing that had occurred to me when I've done that is that some of the things that you were very frustrated with the writers for on a week-to-week basis didn't seem so bad. Like if you're waiting 4 weeks for something to happen, and you're like, why isn't this happening? And then it happens 3 hours later. You're like, oh, okay, that wasn't too bad. You know,
Yeah.
That's a very
Your anticipation super fast.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What else? Any other differences?
I think there's something to like momentum in general, and just even being able to remember. You may not even be able to watch the episode that came previously. You know, they used to sometimes show the episode right before the next episode.
Yeah.
But I found sometimes that was helpful, but also hindered in different ways.
Yeah. Were you gonna say something?
I think what I miss is like when it was once a week, like it was an event.
Mm-hmm.
Like you would prepare snacks and, it was like the Super Bowl once a week.
Yeah.
And when you're binging, you lose that.
Yeah. So that's, I think, I think there are probably lots of ways we could explore the gap there, but I just want to test with you guys. I think there is a gap. I think there is a pretty dramatic change in how people experience horror, because there's a dramatic change in how people experience video entertainment. It has just changed. One of the things that blows my mind is the ability to get to the whole timeline of horror. So if you're really into it, you can know everything you want to know about it. Once upon a time, you couldn't. Like I would subscribe to Fangoria or, when I could, and it was once a month or it was every other month. It was whatever they decided to cover. Right now, you can learn everything there is to know about horror. So first premise, yes, the audience has changed. So there's probably something that we can do differently in our writing to use that to our advantage. So let's set that aside for a second. That's one premise. I think the audience is different. I think its experience with horror is different. And if their experience is different, our writing can probably take advantage of it. But I think the first thing that I said, which is how do we write effective horror, to me is more the core of this conversation, because I'm not sure, and my premise for this part of the conversation is, I don't think the fundamentals of experiencing horror have changed. I think the consumption of entertainment has changed, but I don't think the shit that scares us is different. I think these are basic universal elements of the psyche of humans. So if you buy that, I think where you start a conversation about how do we write effective horror for the contemporary audience, I think you start with, how do I write effective horror? What does that look like? Something that was really interesting to me when I was putting this together is I'm really like a dyed-in-the-wool. It wasn't cool when I liked it. I don't think I'm all cool because I used to like it and other people didn't. I'm just telling you, I've always liked horror. It's what I watched. It's what I read. It's what I wrote. Just really liked it. And I sat down to do this and I thought, oh, okay, well, so like, what's the definition of horror? What's that shit? And then I went, I don't know. There is not, and I did a quick Google. People have ideas about it, but it's not like somebody has identified through study, here's the definition of horror. So I'm curious, let's take 60 seconds. Again, you can't get it wrong. And I've got a proposal for us to work with, but if you had to come up with one now or something close to it, how would you define horror?
I think it's so personal. Horror to me is so different to what horror to you is. Like, and that's what makes horror great and horror hard to write or make, because I love my types of horror, but there is a whole realm of horror films and horror books and horror everything that's not my cup of tea, that I wouldn't watch even if it was daylight and there were 100 people in the house. But there are films that I love that other people are like, how do you watch that?
Yeah.
So I think it's and that's what makes horror great. because
There are
it's
different
so-
types that we like,
Yeah,
right?
it's so personal.
Yeah.
So my definition of horror is completely different.
So what do you like? What is a part of it, or what?
And I'm afraid of being eaten. So anything that will eat you.
So something about-
Vampires,
something about fear.
werewolves. Yes.
Something about fear.
For me, and I do enjoy gore, but I don't enjoy I'm very specific with the gore I like. I like the slasher films of the 80s. Some of the newer stuff that's just gratuitous is not for me. So yeah, but it's definitely something that scares you or excites you, but
Okay.
it's incredibly personal.
Yeah, Carl.
Here's a theory I've always had, and this is the first time I've uttered it, so I'm interested to see what people think.
Yes.
I define horror as anything which makes you feel wildly uncomfortable.
Ooh.
Being
Okay.
unprepared for a test could be a horrifying experience.
Discomfort.
Being on an incredibly bad date could be a horrifying experience.
Okay.
I've been there.
And so that's the most distilled way I've ever thought of it,
Okay.
because it is different for everyone.
All right. Yeah.
I like both those things, and what's interesting, I think there's almost like a meta layer to it, where it's more than just like what it is it that makes you uncomfortable. It's the fact that you have to be confronted with it.
Yep.
Right. So it's about the pacing of that confrontation or the way that you confront it. If you just throw something out there, it's going to hit differently regardless of your personalized fear
Mhm.
versus if you pace it out or if you kind of measure how it creeps up on you. But the confrontation itself is part of, or like a unifying aspect of that.
Yeah.
That fear, whether it's personal or uncomfortable.
Unexpectedly being confronted.
And that's also part of it, I think.
Well, I think we're building a definition. Any other thoughts?
I mean, as an audience member, for me, what I love about a good horror film is it feels like if you could make a roller coaster ride a movie, where it's building, and then you come down, and then it just keeps happening, and it's a ride.
Yeah. Okay.
And I don't feel it like that with any other genre as much. I think that's why I love horror.
Has anybody thought about this is not a test. Has anybody thought about a definition of horror before?
No.
I just was shocked at myself that I hadn't. So I'm going to propose one for the purposes of the next 45 minutes. Love for you to go with it. If somebody just can't see themselves enough in it, that's okay. Here's what I came up with after doing what we just did for a while. My working definition is horror is the surprising discovery that the world is not the way you thought it was, and that difference is trying to kill you. So, surprising discovery, unexpected, that the world is not what you thought it was. Some guardrails that were deep in your psyche that you never thought about are gone now. And as a result, you are under threat, right? You have a reason to fear. You're being confronted by it. So for me, reactions to that, so surprising discovery, it's got to be unexpected. Guardrail, some boundary that protected you is now gone. You're vulnerable, and there's a threat to you. So kill can mean different things we can talk about in a minute. But thoughts about that for us to use for today?
I've got one question.
Hit me.
What if, so given that definition, what if you've suspected it all along?
Yeah.
Would that still be part of your definition, or is that maybe like a subclass? You've suspected it all along, it still comes your way, you're still frightened, it still does all the rest of the definition.
I think for me that works, because I would say you suspected it all along, but probably there was some guardrail that was protecting you from it, right? You suspected it, but you didn't know. So maybe that was the guardrail, is that you didn't have it confirmed.
Thanks, Jay.
Plus, it's also the definition of suspense. And I think suspense absolutely fits in the horror genre.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
If I say to you, I'm going to come slap you at the end of the panel, you now sit or wait for me to slap you at the end of the panel. If I just slap you without telling you, that's shock. I think both of us.
Oh, this is a good segue. Yeah. So we'll come back to the breaking down the definition, because I think for me that leads us into the fundamentals of what makes horror effective. So we'll go back to that, but just to give you a sense of, so I went like, okay, what's the definition? Well, I couldn't really find a working definition, but some people who have done this for a long time do have a point of view about types of horror or categories of horror. Chris, I'm going to Stephen King here, or is that?
Oh, I'm
Or
laughing.
you have your own?
I'm laughing because of the experiences I've had with people's definitions of what is and isn't horror through my company.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, so anybody know Stephen King's 3 types of horror by any chance? I have never found this super accessible. I think I get it. It's 3 experiences. One is revulsion, which he calls the gross out. And this is just something so shocking. You have they essentially go from physiological response to emotional response. So something so shocking, you're revolted by it, right? The gross out. A severed head is like, whatever, the gross out. The horror, which I need to check because something unnatural to the point of incomprehensible. He also said the horror is you hear some sounds and something with a claw grabs your arm. So to him, that's the horror. And then terror, which he thinks is the highest level, the thing he shoots for the most, is the suspenseful moment of that feeling before you reveal the monster. So in this one, he described, you hear something in the room, something brushes up against you, you turn around and nothing's there. So just to give you a landscape, for me, I love Stephen King. I think I've read almost everything he's written. This doesn't do much for me, but I'm like, he's considered the master of suspense, right? So pay some attention to it. I have a working definition of 2 categories that has worked for me that I'll share. You guys can see if it's useful for you. For me, I think the 2 kinds of horror, I typically find I can categorize everything into 2 kinds of horror. One is, and there are some echoes in in Stephen King's definitions. One is what shouldn't be is, what shouldn't be is. So something fantastical, imaginary, unnatural, supernatural. It shouldn't be, right? It doesn't fit in the natural world, but it is. I see it. I'm looking at it. It's there. To me, that's, I think, the horror that he's talking about. And then what should be isn't. So that's my wife, right? She should be, but she isn't. There's something else in there, something that's gotten on the inside of my guardrails. So to me, that I think matches somewhat with the terror is 3rd level, but those are categories I've used. I also, so in this Google, I mean, there are lots of people categorizing horror. Seth Sherwood, who's a screenwriter, he had 12 kinds of scares in a big list of his. So there's lots of them out there. What I would say is, I don't know if there's a definitive framework, but I think using a definition and then having a framework is on the way to writing effective horror for any audience, for yourself. I think understanding the mechanism of it is ultimately how you get to doing it really effectively. So I'm curious, after sharing those and mine and some of those, anybody have any other thoughts about categories of horror? It's okay if you don't.
It can happen in real life.
Say more about that.
Horror based on reality. Taking aspects of what's going on in media, pop culture. It can happen in real life, which would be horrific for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Walking away from the film thinking, I think I read something about that going on over in the UK. I think it might have that kind of a vibe.
Yeah. Oh, that's an actual threat.
Yeah.
Got it.
I feel like that would fall into it shouldn't be, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like people shouldn't get kidnapped, but they do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's as like nerdy and academic as we'll be for the rest of the time. I think it's really important to lay a strategic framework because I think otherwise we're operating on the surface. It doesn't help us be as effective. So just for myself, wanted to dive down and wondered if it would help you guys. So thought I would share. So if we work with that definition, if we believe that the fundamentals of horror are basically applicable to humans, that, you know, we're going right to the motherboard on humans. And if we work with this definition where we said surprising discovery, guardrails you thought were there are gone, you're vulnerable, and something's trying to hurt you. I said kill. For me, the kill part is like, could be trying to kill you, end your life, but could be trying to take something irreversibly away from you. And that could be your mind, your freedom, a loved one, a dream, right? A thing that's really important or valuable to you. I don't think kill is literal, but I just think it's that the threat is primal and like the highest of stakes, right? This is, I think, one of the things maybe that separates horror from drama is drama, many times it is of the everyday. And I think horror is extraordinary. It's of the extraordinary. Okay, so let's work through those and sort of test them. So the first one is surprise. So fundamental to horror is that it's a surprise. It's unexpected. So hey, Rachel, how are you? Hey there. So,
We're in class.
So I have often, and I'm sure you have often too, heard criticism of movies that weren't well received because people said it was boring. It didn't add anything new. I think there's a whole class of criticism of movies or stories or scripts where what we're saying is it didn't surprise me. It didn't go somewhere I didn't expect. So how do we apply this as a lesson? I can't remember who told me this, but somebody told me years ago, just trash your first idea. Whatever your first idea about the next thing to happen in your script is, just throw it out, make yourself come up with something else. Like that's a way to eventually work your pathways to something surprising. So that's number one, surprise as a fundamental element. Number two, boundaries. We talked about a boundary or a guardrail or something that's essential to you feeling safe is gone. And I think what ramps this up is the more they're a given in everyday life, the scarier it is when they're gone. So like, I don't know, I'm just making this up, so don't laugh at me if it's dumb, but like if I said gravity is going to turn off in 15 minutes, like to me, that's pretty fucking terrifying, right? I mean, you immediately, it's such a given. We entirely rely on it. And you can immediately imagine what happens if gravity turns off. Really bad, right? So some boundary, some way of keeping you safe suddenly disappears or is taken from you. I think makes things scary. So surprise, boundaries, danger. Like I said, kill can be figurative or literal. Something wants to kill you or kill somebody close to you, but could be somebody wants to take you. I mean, how many body snatcher movies are there? There are 4, 5, I can't remember, because that's a really scary story. It's a scary story to imagine being taken over and replaced, right? It's taking something, it's taking your identity. Scary story.
I'm trying to monitor comments, sorry.
Okay, so those are the elements in our definition. I think there are a couple other things specific to movies. So we're talking about screenwriting. Your screenplay is whole and beautiful and meaningful and valuable as a screenplay. Most of us write them because we would like to make them into movies or see them be made into movies. You don't have to. You can write a screenplay and it's awesome that it's a screenplay. But in the format that we hope to deliver to audiences, a couple other things matter. You've heard, number one is a proxy. The audience has to have a proxy. We all know that, but do we know why? Do we know why? Why does the audience have to have a proxy in the movie? Why do they have to see themselves eventually suspend disbelief to the point where they are that person emotionally and having those things happen to them? Why is that so important? Why is it necessary? Why is it required for an effective movie, especially horror?
I guess otherwise, why would they care?
Yeah, you're there for the emotional experience, right? You can't have an emotional experience if you're not connected to what's happening on the screen. So if you don't have that emotional connection, if you can't feel the vulnerability and the boundaries taken away and the threat, you're not having an emotional experience. You're not having what you're there for. So you have to have a proxy. So let's talk about main characters for a minute as a group. So what are some things you can do? And I assume everyone has written a screenplay. What are things that you do to make that main character emotionally compelling, ultimately a proxy, an avatar for the viewer or for the reader if they're experiencing it as a screenplay? What are some things you do in that character and building that character?
I think you have to show their vulnerability, some sort of weakness.
Okay.
For me, I try to bring a little bit of me into it because I feel like, my emotional experience, like I can't speak anything better than what is mine.
Yeah.
And if I can, then somebody else will feel what I felt. I don't know, so bringing me to it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you're a person,
Yeah.
so you can trust that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why it's important to set up circumstances that don't just kind of revolve around the horror itself. You have to show that they are the actual person, whether it's coming from us or somebody else's inspiration. There has to be some way to say, like, okay, this is a real person that I can relate to.
I think that's a really profound insight. I mean, sort of at the heart of the whole conversation we're having is, if you knew there was a monster 10 million light away, and it's like a voracious, deadly, terrible monster, but it can never get here, would you be afraid of it? I mean, the obvious answer is no. What we fear when we experience horror, what we're experiencing is threatened empathy for another human, for another creature. Could be an animal, right? Could be, but that's what we're experiencing is like, oh no, don't do that to them, because it's how we hope other people will feel about us. So you have to have the proxy, because that really is the pathway to horror. There's no horror without a person we care about, a person we're connected to, a person we see ourselves in under threat, right? At least that's what I take from that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any other tips about? You okay, Jim? Any other tips about creating a proxy, creating an avatar, having somebody connected to your main character? I just think this is a really important point. I am a structure guy. I am a save the cat guy. I believe in save the cat. I know it's sort of like Nickelback. It's really, everybody likes to make fun of it, but also everybody likes Photograph. Like, I know that you yeah.
First of all, Photograph is sung by Def Leppard. I don't even know what Nickelback is. So.
See, pretending. Anyway, I know it's popular in some circles to bash Save the Cat, but I do think it distills a really effective structure. I forgot what I got off on Nickelback, and now I forget what I was saying. What were we talking about?
You got off on
The
it.
likability of the character. Right? You're
Yeah.
talking about
Oh,
the
what do we
like
do?
the
What do we do to make the
structure.
character? It's
that, but then
literally in
you
Save the
come back
Cat.
up.
It's the title. So that you have
Yeah.
the character save the cat, so everybody goes
Exactly.
like, "Oh, that's a good person. That's somebody I can root for."
Yeah.
Yeah. Last thoughts on this? Anybody? Okay. The other thing, so proxy specific to movies. The other thing is stakes. So I can tell you that monster wants to like kill your kid, right? But until we see it, until we see the person's response to seeing it, until we see the emotion in the lead character who is us, it's not real. It's not scary, right? This is why so often in the first act, you have a foreshadowing of the threat, right? And then it comes back and it is tenfold more impactful, because now I've got somebody that I care about and I can see that person respond to it, right? So I respond to it at first going like, yeah, in theory, that's a bad thing. I would hate for that like 10-mouthed thing to like eat my face off. But then when I built a connection to the lead character, now I've got something real where it's about me, because they're my proxy. Okay, so that's my suggested breakdown of the fundamentals of horror as a starting point. what do you think? Are we on our way to something that works as a framework? Do you think it's missing anything? So we said, I'll just review for you. Sorry, I was gonna write it on something, but they didn't have anything to write with at the hotel, which I thought was funny.
It's also on brand.
It's on brand for them. So we said, surprise, removed boundaries, danger, threat, and then specific to movies, proxy and stakes. So as a jambalaya of horror, do we think we're missing anything? What else are you thinking about? What's that make you think about? Yeah.
I think for me, what sometimes keeps me watching, I don't watch a lot of horror, I'll be honest. I like more suspense, and that's what I'm working on right now. But I like an unraveling. It's more what you don't tell me that keeps me watching than you just jump scaring me. Because that, to me, it kind of pulls me out of what you're doing. I like a good slow burn of information. And that's what'll keep me going on an idea.
Yeah.
It'll keep me engaged in what's going on.
Do you mean sort of like a
I don't know
mystery
what
to
it's
solve?
called. Yeah, like maybe like the movie Nope would be a really good example of that. So you don't know what's happening and you don't know why. And obviously they're building, you like the characters and you're trying to know about them, but you're not given very much at all until the very end. But I don't know, for me, that's kind of what I like is the not knowing.
I agree
that
with
keeps
that.
me interested.
I think it's pretty universal to stories. I don't know. For me, I mean, that is the thing I appreciate in stories generally. Yeah.
One of the things that was interesting, got me thinking was, because movies are all about creating an emotional response from your viewer at the end. And horror movies, they want us to come away a little disturbed, right? A little unsettled. And so in many ways, the stakes in a horror movie are smaller and personal. You're watching an action film where you want to go along on this roller coaster ride. The stakes are, the world is at stake. And it's just interesting where you get a more intense emotional reaction from a movie with objectively smaller stakes.
Yeah.
I think it's just sort of something kind of.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jim. I think War of the Worlds is kind of having a moment right now. I've seen a bunch of people, I don't know if it just got onto some new streaming service or something. I've seen a bunch of people now rewatch it. The Tom Cruise one.
Yeah.
And like very favorable responses, which I thought it was okay. I mean, I saw it in the theater. I don't know how, it was a long time ago. But that's a movie where the world is the thing at stake and we wouldn't be able to emotionally connect to it, except it's down to, you know, a guy and his kid, right? Isn't Tom Cruise?
A guy and two kids, yeah.
Yeah.
A bad father and two kids. It's a Spielberg. So there you go.
Yeah. But just to support your point, right? Like that's the thing that creates the proxy on screen is it's intimate and human. Yeah, great point. Okay, so returning to our original question. Our original question is, how do we write effective horror for the contemporary audience? And our first premise that we're testing is, well, you do that just by writing effective horror, right? It's not necessarily different for today's audience. You don't necessarily write it differently for today's audience than you might have, you know, for an audience 20 years ago or 200 years ago or 2000 years ago. The fundamentals of what scares humans are largely the same. That you are surprised by the removal of guardrails that you assumed would always be there, that kept you safe, and now you're under threat. Right? The world has changed, now you're under threat. However, we talked about it at the beginning, holy shit, has the market changed? And our experience consuming media, it does change our experience with the media. So this idea that we talked about where if you watch once a week versus you watch it all compressed, you know, 10 hours at a time. One of the things I've experienced is you pick up on continuity issues. If you watch a show a whole season or multiple seasons, right? And you run through it, you go like, no, I remember in season 2, that's not what happened. Because you just watched season 2 yesterday, right? It wasn't 5 years ago. So that's one of the things, how you doing? That's one of the things that compression does. And I think for me, that is representative of the broader compression of just watching a ton of stuff, having access to a ton of stuff, having access to hundreds and thousands and millions of other people who want to talk about that thing and have an opinion about it. So I do think that's changing the experience with what you write, and ultimately, if it becomes a movie, the movie that you make. And I have a couple examples, but this part I don't have figured out, because if I did, I would be out there making a thing right now, because then that would be the guaranteed way to make millions of dollars. And I don't, sadly, I'm sorry to reveal, I don't have that.
But I love that you brought up the fact that how quickly the landscape has changed. Like, because for our lives, we went from 3 channels to 80, and that's about it. And I'm teaching Lonesome Dove, which I'm not sure if people have seen it. And the students are bored in the first episode, but they love it from 2 to 3. And so now my suggestion to them is, how would you restructure it to keep people watching? If they got 15 choices, you make it 5 minutes, you switch out. So I think it's interesting how, in many ways, that slow burn you don't have that opportunity to get them hooked on a slow burn if they might just pop over to Netflix 5 seconds later.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's never been easier to change the channel or change the movie. I mean, within the channel.
True.
You're right. All right, so I'm going to share a couple things that I've noticed, interested in what you take from it or what things you've noticed about what's different now. My broad sense, actually based on some data I've seen about movie-going audiences that Jim and I talked about actually on his podcast, I don't know, 6 months ago, maybe, is that people, because they are drowning in content, are looking for things that feel like events, that feel can't miss, unique, novel, that feel discovered. So few horror examples of from the last few months. Anybody see Barbarian?
Mm-hmm.
Who heard of Barbarian?
Yeah.
Raise your hand.
Oh, yeah.
I stumbled upon it. Yeah.
Oh, well, you had a unique experience. So quickly, Barbarian is a feature film made by a guy who's a comedic actor primarily, who had been, I think, working on the script for like 10 years, got it made. It was pretty buried by, I think it was Lionsgate, if I remember, no real marketing, and then had unbelievable word of mouth. I won't spoil the movie, but it did the things that we're talking about. It had the fundamentals of horror, and it was novel, it was discovered, and it felt like an event. So tons of word of mouth. That's why I went to see it. I went to see it because everybody kept talking about Barbarian. And I went to the theater, and I'm 48, so I'm right down the middle of like current demographics. And in walked, I would guess, 2 high school, I assume they were women, identified as women. 2 people I think were probably high school age. 2 people I think were about college age, and then 2 more people who were about high school age. This was 10 o'clock on a Monday night at a pretty crummy theater. It wasn't at Gateway. It was one up around the corner. Because I think it was novel. And again, without spoiling it, there's a great, I think, monster, a surprise monster in the movie. And the structure is crazy. So as screenwriters, if you have seen it, I assume you thought the same thing. And if you haven't seen it, you should watch it, because it essentially, its first act is its own movie. And then its second act is a different movie, somewhat related to the first movie. It's really unusual structure. And I think that novelty is part of the reason why I connected. I don't know that it was an awesome movie. I mean, I don't know that it was an awesome movie.
I mean, that's all I can say.
But it was a discovered experience for people.
It definitely had moments that I thought was cool, but yeah, it had a lot of problems. And I got hooked on the don't even, like, what I saw was don't even look up anything about it, just go see it. So I went inspecting, thinking something like Mandy, you know. So I went in thinking like I'm gonna be blown away by this mashup of like horror and science fiction and good music, and like for the first like 30 minutes I was like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
Like, and then I was like, oh, okay. And then I was like, oh.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I feel like that about a lot of horror movies I've seen. So no, it wasn't a total waste of time. So,
I love those descriptions. I
It is one where like,
Then I was like, whoa.
I ask people, I'm like, have you seen it? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna play it for you, and I'm gonna videotape your reactions
Yeah.
while you're watching it.
I'm going to bring up two other examples that I think support this. I could be wrong. I mean, this is just my current interpretation of what's happening in movie consumption. So two more. One is Terrifier 2. So Terrifier built crazy word of mouth, had a novel element, had a couple novel elements, got a reputation for tons of gore and for an unusual villain. Most people heard about it. More people heard about it than saw it. Terrifier 2 goes into the theater, makes millions and millions of dollars on $250,000 budget, I think.
Whoa.
Is that right? Millions of dollars. So the people who made that are millionaires now.
They were the biggest hit at Days of the Dead. They had the longest line. Like
Yep.
they had a whole room to themselves just about.
Yep.
And everybody was there for them.
And they made Terrifier. Terrifier is essentially, and somebody correct me, it's essentially a remake of a, or uses a character.
It's an expansion of a short.
Yeah, of a short. But that short is old.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a long time ago.
I saw it at a film festival many years ago.
A million years ago. Okay, so Terrifier, another example. I don't want to go too far into that one. And then most recently, Skinamarink. So who has heard of Skinamarink? Okay. Yeah. Anybody seen it?
Mm.
Okay. So $10,000 feature by Kyle Ball, it's Canadian. Tremendous word of mouth because it's a novel story. The story is kids wake up in a house alone and all the doors and windows have disappeared. But it also had the story of being pirated after Fantasia. And that was the thing that really was the booster rocket for it. Suddenly it had a hero story for Kyle, which was like, this poor guy made this movie. It's so popular that everybody's stealing it. We should go see it when it comes out and is available legitimately. So that's part of it. I mean, I think a lot of people genuinely love the movie. So, and not in any way taken away from that. I'm saying it had these other elements that are elements specific to our current environment of movie consumption. Word of mouth, novel, an interesting story. There's also a sense, I think, across those three of authenticity, right? That it's really one person or a team with a vision who made that movie. And that's why it's sort of weird or strange or a sense of discovery. So that's as far as I've gotten on this other part of it. I feel pretty good. Like I'm going to use the stuff that I worked up for like definition of horror and that sort of thing in my writing. But this other thing about how do we write specifically for the current audience or use it to our advantage, that's as far as I've gotten. So I'm curious about your thoughts. So with those examples or other recent examples, why things have succeeded that maybe were small movies. Carla?
Make it a period piece like X. Those guardrails of modern conveniences, take them away. And like imagine if X was set in modern times.
X is a great example. I'm just going to say, I think that's true, right? Like you take away cell phones and that sort of thing. I think the big thing about X for me was that it was a surprise trilogy. I think that's the thing that was the booster rocket, right? Because
for me, it reminded
Pearl
me
came out.
of 80s slasher films.
Yeah.
You know, like in such a way, like he really hit the nostalgia with it so hard. And
and also it's porn, right? Like they're people.
And the third one is set in the 80s. It's going to be set in the 80s.
yeah, it's the extension of her.
Right,
So
right.
Pearl is the
Yeah,
old
origin,
lady
right.
before
And then
X is
70s.
Yeah, and
But not just porn, your grandfather's porn.
Yeah.
You know, so that was again
Some
that
nostalgia
porn.
it seemed new to a young audience.
That's like the yuckiest phrase I think I have.
I think it's the model for next year's
In a
art,
while.
though. Grandparent porn. Anybody
Your
want that?
grandfather's porn.
Wow.
Yes, and then we're off and running.
So we have 10 minutes or so left. We have lots of stuff here to discuss. I assume we're all here because we want to write more effectively or specifically write horror more effectively. So everything that we talked about are stuff you came in thinking about. What should we talk more about? What can make us more effective? Yeah.
I think a central question or definition that maybe we can think about separately or together is what does novel mean?
Yeah.
I think that that's for any and all industries or any and all art forms. And as you've been talking about, I've been trying to come up with a definition, and it's like I keep grabbing things and then things spill out on the other end. And so yeah, because that is the other kind of like bajillion-dollar question is what's novel?
Yeah.
Right.
Thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that's one of the biggest struggles, especially with horror. I mean, what hasn't been done?
Give me the same thing, only different.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think we probably all struggle with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, it's about being surprised. And I don't think I'm being semantic. I think there's you're right. I said novel a bunch of times, but in our definition is surprise, right? Something surprised me. It was unexpected. That probably rotates in time and across generations. What surprises you probably has changed as people have consumed more and compressed horror and know the timeline of horror. Maybe they're less likely to be surprised. Maybe it's more powerful when you are surprised now because you are less frequently surprised. That could be. I don't know. What were you thinking?
Just thinking about, like, my teenagers are into horror and they watch horror with me, and the horror they gravitate to is the 80s. And the reason why I've always believed is because we get so invested in those characters because they're so multi-layered and we know about them and they are a proxy. And I think sometimes the horror that comes out now, they're so surface. I have a hard time connecting to them. And, you know, for me, it's like with X, like that was how, like, I was invested in all those characters, even the bad ones. Like, you know, so how do we get back to the multi-layered? You know, we spend a lot of time now in the flash and not in the character. Do you know what I mean by like the superhero movies? Some of the things that I walk away from those, I don't remember much about them because we're not as invested in the layers. We're invested in the surface and what they do with it. So like, not that I don't like superhero movies, I do, but I don't remember anything about them. Yet I can quote to you 1,080 80s movies.
I might push back and say, though, I feel like one of the problems with 80s horror is it seems like it was all terrible characters lined up to be killed. 70s horror, I felt like really dove into character more. I think you care about The Exorcist because you care about that relationship, but I can't tell you any of the characters in Friday the 13th except for the
Well,
one
I'm
the guy
talking
from the
more like
Goonies was in.
Nightmare on Elm Street and the fact that I was so invested in those children and also their parents' story and the backstory.
Definitely the
behind
first
it.
one.
Yeah, and
The
so
fifth one was The Wicked Witch of the West. I'm not sure.
But you're right. Some of those are definitely the lineup horrors, and I don't remember as much about them as I do. But like, I was invested in the Lost Boys. Like, even though that's pop horror, that's still horror, and like, I was so invested in all of those characters. The vampires, you know, the mom who had just been divorced, the grandpa. Oh God, he was so interesting.
The sax player.
Yeah,
I mean, that leads us to, I think, the word recontextualization. Because Lost Boys, that was really the first kind of vampire of a new generation. Like teens as vampires. Wasn't really a thing so much, but now it's the main thing.
Yeah.
But back then.
It was unexpected.
Exactly.
It was novel.
Yeah.
It surprised us. But to your point, we connected with characters. So when it sounds like that era for you, you connect more closely, but generally for all of us, right? It's more satisfying if you connect with the characters, if you have the proxy on screen. Totally agree.
My writing has changed because my earlier scripts was more of I'm an 80s girl, more based on that. So more slash and dash, more kills in the script. But now I've changed in my writing. It's kind of like yours. It's a slow 1970s slow burn where I'm trying to develop the characters and all the stuff happens later on. And so bringing it to a modern audience, I might have to pivot again because I'm seeing that, you know.
But that's part of your growth that you've changed.
That's part of my growth. But that's just naturally when I'm like, okay, I did that. Now I want to push myself and do something more. So right now, when I'm writing, is more of a slow burner type of horror.
Okay.
Less kills, and also trying to interject lesson by using extreme violence.
Okay.
This might be a dumb definition of novel, but I think it really comes from a place of being organic. Because I think about, I write music a lot, and so there's people that write just to get on the radio, and then there's people that write because they have to get it out. And I think that's what creates novel, is just it's this idea that has to get out of you, and it's very real and organic.
Yeah.
Authenticity you were talking about.
Yeah.
Sincerity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an
People
interesting word, Carl.
And our younger generation, I think they can sniff that out real quick. They know what's a copy of something.
Like an adult trying to talk in slang.
Yeah, like what's up, dude?
Yeah.
You know,
It's
it's
just-
like, no,
It just
no.
seems strange.
Yeah, it's not
Hey, cool
right.
kids.
So like, that's it.
I think I buy that. I do buy that. I also think, and I think sincerity is a really interesting word, and I know it appeals to me. I also know there are movies that have made a lot of money that I don't know anyone would ever consider sincere. So so there's this other thing, which is like, what is your goal? Which is for a totally different, I think, workshop. But that's interesting to me that, we're talking about what connects to audiences. Well, it could be enough that it's word of mouth and you have to go see it and don't look up anything, just go in and watch it, right? And I'm not calling Barbarian insincere. I'm just saying that the experience of desperately wanting an event and something new, something to be surprised by. It's just interesting to me to think that may not always be a sincere movie also. It could just be fucking weird. Unusual.
But it's not,
Everybody's
not desperate.
What if it's sincerely
It's not
weird?
desperate.
See, it's interesting to about
It's not
Babylon
trying,
Berlin.
so maybe that's a thing too. You know,
I
like a
think- I
song,
think
like,
you're right.
and I know I use songs a lot because that's the world I
Okay.
know, but like a joke song like Red Solo Cup, that song was a joke. It was born out of a joke and then it became a #1 song, but it was still, it wasn't a copy.
Yeah.
It still wasn't a copy.
Well, this is fun, you guys. I
It's
feel
not
like
trying.
no, I think we dug around some really
I
interesting
feel like we should go
things.
upstairs where the tequila is. And
Continue this
Do they have
conversation.
bourbon?
no, and I'm really pissed about that because we have a sponsor for bourbon. He's getting advertised, and I don't care that thing's still running. Fuck this guy. Sorry. Although,
But what made Barbarian sincere is the place where it was set, Michigan, a city that's known as being abandoned in decay.
Mm.
And so if it had been set in Austin, it wouldn't have been the same movie, I don't think.
I think for me, it was hurt by what I thought it might be. I maybe should have looked it up and I
Oh,
would have
that's a
liked it
wole other
better.
thing,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's what I was trying, that's
What was
why I
your
was like,
expectations?
it was my expectations, because I try very hard. I heard a lot about, I'm a huge fan of Raw. And so when her second movie or her next movie came out, I heard so much about Titanic. And then I went to see it and I was like, this is what people were freaking out about. And I feel like if I'd have heard nothing about Titanic, I would have loved it versus I heard so much about this one. And, so sometimes it can backfire on, I may have loved it if I'd have stumbled across it on HBO and been like, oh, what is this? This is weird. I like it.
Your expectations are
my expectations were
alchemical,
huge
right? They
for
change
it.
your
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
So it just wasn't what I thought it was. So yes, you should see it. You may love it. I went in thinking it was going to be something else. And
Okay, we're wrapping up. Proposed for your consideration. This is your summary. We asked ourselves, how can we write more effective horror for the contemporary audience? The proposal here was, well, you start by writing effective horror. And the premise is that horror is pretty fundamental to the human experience, and certain elements create the experience of horror, which we defined in this conversation as a surprising, unexpected, I don't know what I said. It's coming back. Here it is. No, that's not it.
and that
Oh, surprising
certain age.
surprising discovery. Hey, I did like 50 minutes from
I know. I just-
surprising discovery that the world's not what you thought it was, and that difference is trying to kill you. So just maybe, whatever, clumsy, but that was the definition we worked with.
Stranger in a strange land.
Stranger in a Strange Land, we broke that down. We talked about some frameworks, King's framework. I had said I worked with this one about what is, shouldn't be, and what should be, isn't. There are lots of other ones out there. We talked about surprise, boundaries, danger, and then specifically for effective movies in general, having a proxy and having stakes. And then we talked about how the market has changed. There's this compression of consumption. There's incredible access. There's also, we didn't talk enough at all about this, but so much of conversation about content is now an identity game. Like, am I cool? Do I feel cool? Do I feel like I'm in the right group by liking what I like? And it's taking place on a point scoring system, which is social media. So that changes, that's another layer to the expectations and did I like it or not? But we talked about novelty. What is novelty? Does it surprise us? We talked about things having word of mouth, authenticity, and then a making of story. Do we know something about that's unusual or exciting or makes us cheer for the person who made it or the story of the person who made it? Like I mentioned, Kyle, and this is shitty. Kyle having his movie BitTorrented and pirated out of its one, it had one huge festival reception everybody was really excited about. And then he was, and that's like our dream, right? And then it was out there. So that's what we talked about. So I would say take that stuff away, continue to interrogate it for yourself, see what works for you. I'm going to apply some of this stuff, see where it takes me. And let's keep talking about it. Thanks, you guys. This was really fun.
Thank you.